So this is a tough one, and it's something that I've had in the works for a while, but given the delicacy of the topic, I had to kind of keep revisiting it for a bit. I should start by saying that if you're a trans person who's recently out, or you're someone in the process of questioning, there might be some challenging things in this one for you to hear, so just keep that in mind going forward. You're probably going to watch it before you send it on to the people that it's actually made for anyway, I realize that, but just remember that while this one involves you, this video is not specifically for you. So who is it for? I wanted to make this one for the parents of trans and questioning people, because in a lot of the trans community spaces that I'm in, I usually see the topic of parents coming up with overwhelmingly negative connotations, mostly because of the conversations that trans people end up having with their parents when they come out or try to talk to them about the fact that they're questioning their gender. The sad fact of the matter is, a lot of the reactions that cis parents tend to have when trans people come out or talk about their experiences end up being really damaging for us to hear, especially given that they happen at an incredibly delicate time. So with that said, and this is where things might get a little bit contentious, trans people need support and acceptance. That's first and foremost. But it's also kind of unfair and unrealistic to act like having a child come out as trans isn't really challenging for a lot of parents. And it shouldn't be, but it is, for a number of different reasons. And I want to talk about some of those, hopefully to put to rest some of the pain and confusion surrounding them. So if you're the parent of a trans person, let me start by saying thank you for being here. Thank you for putting the time in to understand your child and their experience better. You making the effort here is not only going to be the difference between your own distress versus your peace of mind, but also your child's suffering versus their flourishing. So hang in there, because I know you love your kid or you wouldn't be here. So let's lean into that security going forward. And also remember that if your child sent you this video, it's because they love you and they want you to understand what they're going through so that they can keep you in their life and keep you informed. It's often incredibly helpful to feel seen and understood when we're going through something really challenging, even if being seen and understood doesn't necessarily alleviate the challenge. Just knowing that you're not spiraling out of control in a pursuit with no end goal helps you keep your footing. However, it's extremely important for us to know where, when, and how we get that validation. That is to say, if your child just told you that they're trans, or that they think they might be trans, they are not the person that you should be going to with your worries and concerns and doubts about this fact. They just pointed to where it hurts, and you don't need to go squeezing in search of pain. That doesn't mean you shouldn't be honest about your feelings. Just know that there are better people for you to share them with. Intuitively, it makes sense for you to want to share your feelings with your kid right now because they're the other party in this. But this whole situation is already a lot for them to deal with, so if you go piling your worries and your struggles on top of their worries and their struggles, that's just too much for any one person to handle. It was probably already scary for them to talk to you. And it's important to remember that unless your child is quite literally a clinician who specializes in gender, they're not an expert in this. I'm not a geneticist. I can't tell you why I have green eyes, I just know that I have them. One of the first things you probably asked, or at least felt compelled to ask, was, are you sure? This is a tricky one to tackle, because obviously I can't answer that question for your loved one. No one can. That includes you. If and when you ask this question, you have to make sure that you're in a place to hear the answer. From what I've gathered, based on both my own experience and talking to other trans people, when this question is posited, it tends to be with an air of denial, and that's really just not conducive to anything positive. If you say, are you sure? And they say no, only to have you push their doubts, or they say yes, only to have you deny it outright, or try to steer them away from that certainty, what was the point of even asking the question in the first place? Can you honestly say that you actually wanted their input, or were you just searching for a thread to pull so that you could unravel their feelings? When you boil it down, this interaction is probably going to end with the two of you being upset on your own and angry with each other. It can put a huge strain on your relationship, and potentially even damage it permanently. There's no clarity to be found, and you both end up feeling worse. So you really need to ask yourself what the intention behind this question is. If all you're doing is looking for an opportunity to argue, then you've already lost. Because at that point, it kind of becomes more about punishing the other person for your feelings than it does about understanding and helping yourself feel better. You really gotta ask yourself if that's something you want to do to someone that you love. So asking, are you sure, with no real investment in the answer is a no-win situation, I promise you. But let's take a second to acknowledge where the question is coming from, because the fact that you probably shouldn't ask if you're not in the best place to hear the answer, which you likely aren't this early on, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a bad compulsion to have. And I'm going to share my own experience here to hopefully help explain this. It took a long time for me to contextualize what my parents were going through after I'd come out to them. It was very painful and very frustrating having to take on their denial when I'd just broken under the weight of my own after years and years of repression. But I did eventually manage to unpack some of what I think they were going through. I'd lost the security and comfort of the life narrative that I had put in place for myself since I could first start forming memories and concepts of the future. My parents, on the other hand, were losing the life narrative that they had put in place and secured for me the moment that they found out that they were having another baby. Now, I could argue that, it was worse for me because my life is literally all I have removed from everything else, but that honestly doesn't really matter. Who has it hardest isn't the issue here. It's just hard. And there's no amount of pressure and questioning that you can put on your child that's going to alleviate that fact. Losing the life story that you had in mind for your kid is an incredibly painful thing to go through. But trying to push it back on them isn't going to make your pain any easier to deal with. All that's going to do is prolong the process of recovering from it. Likewise, denying or dismissing your child's feelings aren't going to make their feelings go away. It just means that you are not going to be party to them anymore. And is that something you really want? Would you like to be informed of this process or left in the dark about it? Now, I've heard some parents and even some therapists say that acceptance at this point is really hard for parents because it feels like you've lost a child. And I'm just gonna go ahead and call that out as the nonsense that it is. You have not lost a child. Your kid is right there in front of you, trying to share their truth. This is actually an opportunity for you to get to know them better than you ever have. So, while mourning the life you thought they were going to have can be a really important process for some people, don't conflate that with mourning your child. Take a second to imagine what that would feel like. That you were alive and well and the people around you were acting like you were dead and gone. Just sit with that for a little bit. Imagine you were going through something incredibly difficult and rather than support you and acknowledge your struggle, the people who love you just pretended that you were dead or slowly disappearing. Why would you do that to someone you love? What's far more likely at play here isn't feeling like you lost a child, but feeling like you missed something vitally important. You might feel denial about what they told you. You might even be angry at them for feeling this way. But stop and ask yourself this. Do you think it's at least possible that you're reacting with anger or sadness because you feel guilty about having not figured this out on your own? Now, I'm not a parent, so maybe I'm full of it here. But I'd venture that at least some of the resistance comes down to just feeling really awful about the fact that you missed the signs. Because obviously you care a lot about your child. You're their number one fan. You've been with them since day one. And you know everything about them, so how could you have missed this? Well, for what it's worth, many trans people miss the signs too. In fact, we grow up in a world specifically geared toward suppressing our feelings and teaching us how to hide and telling us that this is not a good way to be. So we get really, really good at hiding our feelings and pretending they don't exist, to the point that we even convince ourselves, even if we've grown up in homes that encourage introspection and honesty. Being trans is not easy. It's not something that the vast majority of people would choose to be. So when the signs pop up, we have a tendency to just kind of squish them back down and carry on like nothing's wrong. It's really important for trans people to not punish ourselves for missing the signals. And it's equally as important for the cis people who love us to not punish themselves for missing them as well. You're allowed to forgive yourself. And rather than punishing yourself or your child for not realizing sooner, you should be celebrating the fact that you raised a human being who is so in touch with their feelings and who they are as a person that they were able to reach this conclusion in a world stacked against them figuring it out. You should also celebrate the fact that your child trusts you enough to share this with you, and this is your opportunity to demonstrate that that trust isn't misplaced. There's a lot more to talk about here, and I'm going to follow up with a second video, possibly even a third, to expand on this topic a little bit more. I just don't want to bombard anyone with too much information, especially if you're going through something that's a little bit emotionally demanding right now. But to finish up, let me just summarize some common questions and points of confusion. As we already touched on, maybe they're sure, maybe they're not. But either way, this is a really, really valuable opportunity in their life for a little bit of exploration and self-discovery. If you're resistant or reactive, you are inevitably going to impede their development as a person, regardless of which direction they go in, and we both know that's something that you don't want. So what can you do? Make sure you're providing a safe environment for your child to explore and be authentic. In doing so, you help them figure out how they want to move forward, in addition to ensuring that you are included in that process. Remember, Barring your child from exploration isn't going to stop it from happening, it's just going to mean that you're not included in it. The more that you insist that this is just a phase, the more they're going to lose a sense of security and direction, which means that even if it is just a phase, they're not going to have the space that they need to figure that out. With that said, it's really important for you to make this space without the specific intent of your child getting over their feelings. Statistically speaking, and we'll talk about numbers more in the next video, it is far more likely that they are trans. And it's your responsibility to start preparing and just get ready for the fact that they might want to move forward with a transition, regardless of what that looks like. Next, your feelings are understandable, but they are yours, and it is not on your child to help you deal with them, even if those feelings originate around your kid. You can look for support groups online or in your community. You can also talk to a therapist, and I've included some resources down in the description section to help you kind of figure out where to get started with all that. Another option is journaling and just writing down your feelings as you have them. This not only helps get them out of your head, but it also keeps a record of your development through this process. Basically, just work to find outlets that aren't your kid. Another really important thing that warrants mentioning is trans people know about transphobia better than anybody else. You do not need to remind them of its existence. That's just poking a wound. You can't untrans someone by scaring them away from transition. Forcing them to present as cisgender is not going to make their life less painful. It's just going to make it a different kind of painful. And it tends to be easier to embrace the drawbacks of living your truth than it does to force yourself to live a lie. Next common point of confusion that I want to touch on is that sexuality and gender are different. Your child's patterns of attraction have nothing to do with their gender identity. That's not to say that there isn't overlap. One of the most obvious ones being that, like sexuality, being trans is just how you're born. We don't yet know the specific mechanism behind it, but every major medical association has acknowledged that it is a natural phenomenon. It's nothing your child did, it's nothing you did, it just is. You might be worried about how you're going to explain it to others, but first and foremost, it's really none of their business. Anyone who tries to shame you for having a queer kid is just exposing themselves as someone who would fail as a parent in your position. Recognize that. Personally, I feel really bad for them. Finally, if this is new knowledge in your family, you might be wondering, why now? What happened? Well, at the time of filming this, it is September 2020, and we are in the midst of a global pandemic which has involved a lot of lockdown and therefore a lot of time alone with ourselves. Maybe your kid felt fine when they were engaged with work or school or other demands of their day-to-day life. Maybe you think they'll find that place again when we return to some kind of new normal. But I really want you to think about the fact that your child came to this realization when they were alone with themselves. At the end of the day, regardless of what you fill your life with, the one constant in it is you. If you need to be distanced from your own identity to be happy, is that really happiness? And is that a sustainable state of being? I'm gonna leave it there for now. Like I said, I'll be following this up with another video, maybe 2 other videos, so just sort of expanding on this topic because there's a lot to cover. So please check back if you found this valuable. If you have any suggestions or any questions, please feel free to comment down below and I'll try to incorporate that as well. Go give your kid a hug and tell them that you love them because they love you enough to include you in this, and that's huge. Thanks for watching.